All right, I'm going to hand it over to my associate Shelby Calm at the Fair Farms campaign, and she's going to kick off our program for us tonight.
Awesome, thank you, Bernard. Hello, welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us this evening. As Bernard said, my name is Shelby Calm, and I'm the campaign manager for Fair Farms, which is a project of Waterkeepers Chesapeake. Fair Farms brings together consumers, farmers, public health professionals, and conservationists to advocate for a food system that is equitable, fair to farmers, invests in homegrown healthy foods, and restores our waterways. For today's discussion, we're going to be delving into some complicated and interconnected topics. We're going to be discussing inequity and racism in our food and agriculture system, how that has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, and all of this happening as people are waking up to the injustices that BIPOC communities have been experiencing for centuries, and momentum around the movement for Black lives continues on. Today, we wanted to create a platform where we can talk through these interrelated issues and propose solutions, both policy and otherwise, that are impactful and transformative. We've carved out some time at the end of the discussion to ask questions and engage with the panelists, so I hope that you have come curious. And without further ado, I'm going to pass it along to Bernard Devlin to go over some housekeeping announcements.
Thank you, Shelby. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. We're going to be recording this webinar and it will be available on our social media probably tomorrow. So if you have any questions for our panelists during this event, please submit them using the question and answer function on this Zoom call. And we'll be able to address your questions at the end of our program when we have a question and answer session. And I think that is pretty much it. So I'm going to turn it over to our representatives from M&T Bank. And I just wanted to say a real quick thank you so much for them for joining us tonight. We really, really appreciate everything that you've done.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ana Gonzalez, Senior Relationship Manager here at M&T Bank. It is an honor for me to be here helping Waterkeeper Chesapeake. Really happy and in support of everyone. And Greg and I are here to help and maybe answer any question you guys may have. Greg?
Thanks, Ana, and we're very proud. I'm Greg Smith. I'm the regional manager of our business banking group in Greater Washington, and very proud to partner with Fair Farms and Waterkeepers Chesapeake for this important event. And I was actually going to say, Ana, the Q&A, that's for the important information here tonight. Any boring banking questions, I'm sure Bernard will give our contact information, afterwards. But this conversation today is far more important than any banking stuff, and we're just very proud to be here tonight and support such a worthy cause. So please, though, if you have any questions regarding banking stuff, Bernard will send our information out, but really looking forward to the program here tonight. So thank you.
Wonderful. And with that, we're going to go ahead and start our polling for the evening. We have a few short polls that we'd like our attendees to take. So I'll launch the first one right now. And we'll give just a few moments to get all of our answers. Just another few seconds. All right. I'm going to go ahead and end the first poll. So it is what best describes you, and it looks like we have a pretty even spread with advocate taking the majority at 28%, which is wonderful. And then I'm going to, oh, sorry, I forgot to share the results. There we go. So everyone can see the results now.
Good, a lot of change makers.
Yes, certainly. All right. And I'm going to stop sharing, and then we will kick off the second poll, which is where are you located? We'll give just a few more moments. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end that poll. And it looks like the majority is in Central Maryland, which is wonderful. I'm going to go ahead and close that one and then launch our third poll, which is, how has the pandemic affected your food purchasing choices? All right, just a few more seconds. And I'm going to go ahead and close that poll and share our results. And it looks like people voted for either slightly or significantly for the most part. Great. Thank you so much for answering those questions for us. And with that, I'm going to switch over to our staff attorney, Morgan, to start our program for the evening.
Hi, everyone. I'm Morgan Johnson, staff attorney at Waterkeepers Chesapeake, and it's my honor to introduce our 4 panelists for the evening. Our first panelist is Doug Adams of New Brooklyn Farms. Doug Adams is an entrepreneur, farmer, and DMV native. In 2016, Doug bought some land next to his childhood home in the heart of Mount Rainier and began growing food in container gardens. It was with this vision that Doug created New Brooklyn Farms, a first-generation urban farm and public green space. I'd like to introduce Taffy Gwitira, network advisor and farm-based education network founder of the founder of Telefarm. Taffy Gwitira is a farmer and chef of Zimbabwean and Tanzanian origins. She's also a community building strategist, and her work on transportation advocacy, placemaking, and social justice education have had local and global impacts. She was a farmer with Future Harvest Chesapeake Alliance for Sustainable Agriculture and is a senior fellow of the Environmental Leadership Program. Thanks for joining us, Taffy. I am also going to introduce Jessica Culley of CATA, the Farmworkers Support Committee. Jessica Culley is the general coordinator of CATA, el Comité de Apoyo a los Trabajadores Agrícolas. CATA is a nonprofit organization that was founded by migrant farm workers in southern New Jersey in 1979 and continues to work with Latino immigrant communities along the Delmarva Peninsula in Maryland. CATA's work focuses on issues of workers' rights and health and safety, immigration, and food justice. I'd also like to introduce Senator Cory McCray, who will be joining us at 5:30. Senator McCray is a state senator and a Baltimore native. As a legislator, Senator McCray has worked to champion bills and initiatives to address hunger and food security, both in his district and across the state. I'd like to thank you all for joining us this evening, and we're going to begin asking some questions. So I'm starting it out, and I'd like to say that from the outset of our conversation that we, as the folks who are on this call, most of us, as you said, are advocates. We're policymakers and consumers and students. And most of us have some understanding of the challenges that farm workers and farmers face, particularly during this time. But what we know is that before and now during the COVID-19 pandemic and crisis, that things are particularly and uniquely difficult for farmers and farm workers of color and farmers and farm workers who are undocumented. And so what I'd like to start out is by asking our panelists, how does the legacy of racism in our food and agricultural systems show up today? I'm also thinking in the immigration context, Jessica, you work with immigrant farm workers, and there's been some particular challenges that I know you and your team at CATA have worked on.
Yeah, thanks, Morgan. It's like a big question, right? Like, how do we see the legacy of racism show up in our food system? Because it's stamped all over our food system. Our food system was born and developed on the backs of enslaved people, which has created like ongoing repercussions into that we feel until today. And I'm not, but I think you asked specifically about immigration, and I think it's like fascinating, like when we look at the history of immigration law. One of our first immigration laws was passed in 1882. It was called the Chinese Exclusion Act. And in the decade or two before that law was passed, this country was happily bringing in folks of Asian origin to do farm work, to build the railroads, to do a whole lot of labor. And in the moment like that people were trying to start to build families to enact power, we clamped down and passed laws. And we see that over and over through history, right? Like in the 1930s, there were, I don't even know the number, thousands upon thousands of Mexicans who were actually citizens who were repatriated back to Mexico because we were in the midst of the Great Depression. And then in the 1940s, as soon as we hit World War II, we established a program called the Bracero program to bring many of those same Mexicans back to work in ag. And so that's sort of the history of the way immigration law has worked in general, not just in food and farming, but as like we welcome people in when we want the labor, but we shun, we try to control, prevent them from building any sort of like equity and power.
Thank you for those insights, Jessica, and sharing the history of that. And as you've seen, particularly during this pandemic that we're in and the moment that we're in, how has that affected the farm workers that you work with at CATA? And, are there maybe needs that are being ignored, or ways that, labor might be exploited or really pushed to its limits because of maybe our changing needs as American consumers and Marylanders? I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. I think we see our community has been impacted in two main ways. Folks who have lost work for whatever reason because of their status or lack of status have been unable to really access economic assistance provided by the government. Undocumented folks and folks in mixed status families were like left out of the stimulus package that was passed back in March. And so most of them have been struggling to figure out how to pay the bills and how to get by. At the same time, the folks who are working, especially on farms and in other food jobs, are considered essential workers. But because of they feel pressured to make decisions between maintaining a job for the financial aspects and putting themselves at risk every day with a lot of times inadequate regulations on the employers to make sure that they're abiding by all of the things that we know that have to be in place during this pandemic to keep people safe.
Thanks, Jess.
Is there anything that, Ania, I'm curious, either Taffy or Doug, that you all have to add and things that you would like our audience to know just about kind of how the legacy of racism has showed up in our food system today, some blind spots that might be missed in that narrative. And when we're kind of thinking about our food and agriculture system at large, what are some hidden pieces that aren't often discussed?
So I'm going to let Doug talk about the history of the racism as it affects the African-American community, even though I'm African-American as well, and immigrant. So I'm both and. But I feel also in the space of when we talk about immigrants and agriculture, we don't talk about how many communities of immigrants already have agricultural skills. So as the age of many American farmers is above 60, we have tons of people, tons of untapped talent. So we have what a community that's known as new American farmers who are able to be part of the food system, but face the same sort of discrimination that historically African Americans have faced in agriculture in America. And so that intersectionality of immigrants, newly arrived or relatively newly arrived, and the legacy of racism that people who were born here have had for many years comes together at the same time and makes food insecurity, exacerbated in their communities as well.
Yeah, and I'm really just going to touch on what some of the stats that are pretty prevalent, in the media. 98% of farmers in this country are, not Black. The historic disparities in USDA grant funding and subsidies, given, issued to Black farmers. That's kind of at this point, if you're in the farming community or even not, it's pretty well documented. And then as it relates to more the current, landscape of farming and particularly urban farming, where I kind of am, we're just seeing my experience it's just been pretty difficult to get into the systems, build relationships with organizations that provide funding. And there's just a lot of infrastructure, whether it's land or whether it's just expertise in dealing with receiving public funds and resources that many Black farmers don't have, and leaves them at a big disadvantage.
Thanks, Doug. Taffy, I think you had touched a little bit on immigrant farmers who are here and certain practices that they have already been using in their agriculture in the spaces and places that they're coming from. I wanted to hear, if you don't mind sharing a little bit more about your experience and how some of these things might be overlooked when we think about the broader context of how most people think about the food system.
Okay, thank you for asking. I think one of the things that happens a lot for farmers in America is that any farmer that's a non-white farmer is normally overlooked. And so a lot of farmers from other countries come with regenerative agricultural experience already. So in the same way that Indigenous and Native people in America understand agroecology, so do other countries as well. And so they come with that to America. And then they come to a place where they have to assimilate in many ways, but then they stop growing food according to their cultural ways. And so when we think of the pandemic and we think of food insecurity, a lot of immigrant communities, that food gap is filled by other immigrant people. And my experience has been specifically growing ethnic crops, which I enjoy growing. And I did that specifically because I knew that it was culturally appropriate. And I understood that if you were a person from Africa and you wanted to go to the farmer's market, maybe things like, the regular things that we have at farmers markets, like lettuce and things like that, might not be things that you wanted to eat, but you wanted to be able to buy vegetables that were culturally relevant to you. And so I think there has to be support specifically for groups of farmers like that who want to grow things that are culturally appropriate, specifically as a lens to closing food insecurity gaps, either in urban areas or in rural areas as well.
Yeah, I'm curious, Taffy, what resources were you able to tap into to get where you are? Did you learn about that through, Morgan mentioned the Future Harvest Beginner Farmer Training Program, or was it kind of making connections with others? Or I'm curious to hear a little bit more about your journey to that.
So that's a really big question. So I think Future Harvest helped me understand farming in America, but I already knew how to farm from back home. And so there was not really an opportunity for, there's not really a conversation yet nationally or even locally in the state of Maryland around ethnic farmers who grow ethnic crops. And so basically I had to do my own research and look for smaller like seed keepers and support them. So people like True Loves, people like Southern Seed Exposure, Ira Wallace was a big mentor of mine, and really tried to connect the dots of getting ethnic crops and ethnic seeds because it's a process with the USDA so that I could grow that stuff here. It was very, very difficult, but it's been something that's been a big desire of mine. And what I'm hoping to do is that I'm hoping that it also goes into like sort of cultural normativity around what is grown, what is acceptable as a food and what is not. So a lot of ethnic groups around America stop eating their own food because of food shaming in a way. And so being able to have that broader conversation around what is a sustainable crop to grow, how do we keep that in community, how do we save those seeds, how do we do it in a way that can help the next generation keep that sort of cultural sovereignty as well. And also be part of the same ecosystem that we all want to be part of, because when we grow diversified crops, it helps everybody, not just the ethnic group that is growing them.
Thank you for sharing that insight, Taffy. I'd like to ask for our farmers who are on the panel right now. Because of this unprecedented summer where we had both COVID-19 occurring and, we're in this very changing world and you're working in very changing spaces. And then we also have this renewed movement for Black lives, right? And a lot of momentum and new awareness or growing awareness during that time. And so I'd like to ask how these recent events have impacted your work, whether it's day to day or maybe it's changed some long-term things. I'm really curious to hear how for you as farmers, how that's been.
Well, I can definitely say that there has been obviously an outpouring of resources and opportunities from the the folks we expected from the USDA and fair farms of the world, all the way to all types of private companies and things like that. It has been great to see that, but one key thing that kind of it puts a black eye on it is it's just the lack of wherewithal that many farmers of color just tend to have, and lack of wherewithal leading to you can receive this outpouring of financial investment and resources, but then to properly make use and capitalize of it in the right way, that missing piece is there for a lot of farmers, myself included. It's the technical assistance and just the lack of infrastructure. I can speak to that for New Brooklyn Farms. Is one of the reasons why I'm being aware and privy to many opportunities, but just didn't want to get in over my head. And I'm sure that many other farmers feel the same way. So it's a blessing to see these gestures, be extended at this time. But it just speaks to and it highlights one of the biggest issues in the Black farming community, which is lack of just the intangible infrastructure that you need to be a successful farmer and take advantage of opportunities.
Thank you, Doug. Yeah, it sounds like the longer term, like how do you manage support that might be coming through is a critical piece that as we think we're, throwing money at a problem or adding resources, which can be a good thing, the whole management side can be difficult and critical too. I guess I'd like to know, Taffy, for you, with the space we're in, has there been anything you'd like to say about maybe the lack of markets, or how, maybe the greater space has changed in terms of, adjusting what farm products might be available to certain markets?
I think we've had to adapt, all of us, and adapt our strategies about what we're growing and where we're going to deliver it to, because for a lot of farmers markets were probably like the starting point, or CSAs, or restaurants. So when you grow ethnic crops, it's mainly a lot of restaurants who like to try a variety of vegetables and things like that. And so during the pandemic, we've had to adapt what we're growing quickly, recognizing that a lot of restaurants shut down, a lot of markets. In some states, actually in Virginia, in Maryland was the only state that considered like farmers markets necessary. They had to fight to have farmers markets open in Virginia. And so recognizing that also that people's income was diminished because a lot of people lost their jobs. So maybe signing up for a CSA, or even going to buy a $4, bunch of kale at the farmer's market was out of reach for most people. So being able to adapt, able to adapt quickly. And I just agree totally with what Doug said. And I want people to recognize that for many years, African Americans have been farming in America over centuries, since the beginning of time. And so even though it's exciting right now to support African American farmers, I think there wasn't enough like sort of background work in asking the African American farmers themselves and other Latinx farmers or any other farmers, Bipoc farmers, what do you need as support? There was literally throwing money, very much a humanitarian thing, which is something we love to do and important, but there was no sort of capacity building. And so that's something that we want to see happen in the future.
Yeah, first of all, that's a great point. And I also want to welcome and thank Maryland State Senator Cory McCray for joining us. I want to get back to that point though, Taffy. I know in some conversations that we had with M&T leading up to this, we kind of talked about resource allocation and how that could be done in a more intentional way, whether that be like prioritizing relationship building first and then providing the resources, or providing more like support, education, technical assistance, and follow through. But I'm curious to hear some other ideas that folks might have in making sure that resource allocation can be done in a more like effective and transformative way.
Well, people have sort of talked about reparations for a while now, and I'm not sure whether that's going to happen or not, so no one should hold me to it. But I do believe that policymaking has a fundamental role in resource allocation. And so it's important that we recognize that there were systems in place that stopped people from getting assets and resources to be able to grow their communities, to feed their people. So for those systems to be raised, or for there to be some sort of harm reduction, there has to be new systems put in place. And that's where policymaking is fundamental around resource allocation, so that people see the need to support farmers of color across the board, and have that redistribution so that they can have the capacity to grow their farms and to feed their communities.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to add that I think that something that would strategy in investing in uplifting Black farmers and assisting them during COVID is strategically creating funds and resources that are targeted at sustainable infrastructure. So if you, as opposed to a farmer got hit with COVID and or their business was struck by the effects of COVID on the market, they weren't able to sell at farmers markets, kind of funding incentives or initiatives in their business that are COVID proof, or investing in helping them acquire land, or things that will outlast any disaster or any particular initiative that whoever is funding the resource wants to do. So I just think that overall the focus needs to be on teaching these farmers to fish forever as opposed to feeding them today.
Senator McCray, I am so glad that you're here with us. As you know, intimately, you've addressed head-on food insecurity issues. And this pandemic has been such a challenge in that issue. Back from March to April, when we were thinking through, what we wanted to talk about, we were looking at from March to April of this year, so kind of like the beginning of the pandemic and so much uncertainty, there was a 400% increase in SNAP applications across the state of Maryland. And then we were looking at Baltimore City in particular, that was a 600% increase over the course of just 1 month. And so this has been such a great challenge. And we want to know what you have seen firsthand, for your constituents and the people who you fight for every day.
Yep. Morgan, I think that it'll be appropriate just to say thank you for this opportunity to be able to speak to the issue. It's and just the opportunity to be able to share this space with so many phenomenal people. As I was coming in, I heard Taffy speak to it in reference to how important policy plays a role and intersects with the everyday lives that we have. And that's a very, very important part. And Taffy makes a great point, because you got to remember that the makeup of the bodies that we have at this moment, we're not diverse from an ethnicity standpoint, from a gender standpoint, from an income standpoint. So how could the policies actually benefit the neighbor, or truly benefit all neighborhoods versus some neighborhoods? And Morgan, as you bring up the issue of SNAP, the reality is that we're dealing with a number of constituent calls, from unemployment, but most importantly, you brought up SNAP. And one of the things is exhausted the bandwidth for DSS and DHR at this moment, you realize they don't even have enough staff to keep up with the calls that are coming in. I'm thankful for some of our thought leaders and our thought partners that have realized that during this COVID-19 experience, that this is very, very important and are organizing healthy food opportunities throughout my district. So I just want to make sure that we lift up those partners, that the community partners that are making sure that our seniors that should not be coming out the house should minimize the movement that they're having, that the food is actually delivered right there to them. The second thing I just like to lift up is some of the policy things that we've already been able to work on, if I can. So one of the initiatives, just 2019, as we talk about SNAP, let's think about all these young people. And let's think about all these young people in K through 12. While we may not want to recognize it, that the only meal that they may receive is while they're in school. So during that breakfast and lunch opportunity may be that. So how do we think about that during a COVID experience? How do we think about that during the summer months when we have this extended vacation, June, July, and August? How do we think about that when we have the holiday season and we take that extra week off? Some of us may enjoy that space, but there are a lot of folks that is unbeneficial for, because that is the space of opportunity for them, which is school is a safe haven. And one of the pieces of policy, as I'm looking at it through the screen, we did Senate Bill 218. I worked with Delegate Pam Queen on this, and I worked with tons of advocates across the state of Maryland to lift this issue up to make sure that we can add an extra $30 during the months of June, during the months of July, during the months of August, and then an extra $10 to our SNAP cards during the month of December. So making sure that we recognize that how important this is, especially for our young people. And then as we talk about, I'm gonna go back to Taffy because she like resonated with me and hit me immediately as I walked through this Zoom video. But she from a policy standpoint, even think about our transportation and how our transportation is set up. And is it set up for all communities to be able to get to these healthy food options that are so necessary? So I was glad to be able to work on Senate Bill 116. When we think about complete streets, whether it's a local jurisdiction, whether it's our state jurisdiction, our federal government giving us money, as they're thinking about the planning, we should be planning especially sensitive to those folks that lack access, even greater at a greater visibility. But most importantly, so we were glad to pass Senate Bill 116 that kind of said anytime that you're planning for complete streets, no matter whether it's local or state, that you have to take food access. Make sure that the supermarkets are available. Make sure that the farmers markets are available. Just make sure that fresh food has that opportunity when you think through that plan. And so I just want to reiterate, and I do not want to hog up the time, but I want to say thank you for this opportunity again on this important subject.
Yeah, no, thank you for speaking to that. I have a question for Jessica. So we've talked a little bit about, how there have been, or we've thought through solutions to kind of address constituents' needs and farmers' needs, but I'm curious about whether or not, I know there's been some momentum in Maryland to look at farm worker protections. Do you think that's something that we're seeing across the board? Is this a population that more people are also kind of realizing could use extra support, and although they are often left out of the narrative? I'm just curious to hear you kind of speak to that.
I think there's been some increased invisibility for the folks who are doing the work of, growing and picking our food every day. I think it was really highlighted this summer during the wildfires in California and in the Northwest. I think there was photography done that just really captured like the sort of insane moment that people found themselves working during a pandemic when the skies were filled with like ash, and that brought like at least a moment of like sort of awareness. And there's been, I think, some around essential workers, but I think it's taking that moment and translating it into, as Taffy was saying, something sustainable, right? Because I think there's a lot of times that there's very much a humanitarian response, and I very much appreciate that Taffy really captured the really captured how the difference, right? So we can respond, we can donate masks to people, we can send money, donate to funds, but what's the long-term changes we're making in order to improve things? So in the state of Maryland, a lot of farm workers on smaller farms are left out of minimum wage laws. There's a right to overtime, but only after you've worked at least 60 hours a week. There's been no mandatory protections for farm workers, which is what I think you were talking about, Shelby, that there's been an effort to come together to demand more mandatory protections, at least during the pandemic, for farm and other food workers, right? So on the Eastern Shore, the poultry workers is a really big concern, and they've turned into really huge hotspots for COVID. And those communities have been just really, really impacted hard by the pandemic. And so, yes, I do think that there is an increased amount of interest, but it's incumbent upon us to take that interest and harness it and make it sustainable, so that the next pandemic that hits, because this is not the last one we're going to have, that BIPOC farmers and farm workers do not find themselves struggling in the same situation.
So I'd like to wrap out maybe our thinking about, the pandemic and how that's affected our food system by thinking through, at the beginning of the pandemic, we saw real supply chain disruptions with consumers, scrambling and, scratching and trying to figure out where to go for pantry staples or for other goods and food basics. And a lot of people really turned to the local farming community to fill those gaps. And they also look to, mutual aid groups within their greater community. And so I'm curious to hear from our local farmers and folks who work with farm workers, or maybe anyone here who's aware of the mutual aid and how those systems really came into play and support people during a time of such great supply chain instability.
Hi, so I would say that there was definitely a lot of mutual aid during the pandemic, but I think there's also a lot of compassion fatigue right now, and also pandemic fatigue. And because mutual aid is really dependent on your resource capability and your capacity. And so in Baltimore, anyway, there was a lot of, community groups coordinating things, but there is nothing institutionalized specifically. So it was, and it works well in Baltimore because we have a deep and informal economy, and people were able to support each other by, buying from each other and, buying direct from farmers and things like that. But long term, it's unsustainable again. And we have to talk really about how when you have come from a community that has deprivation and how a pandemic hits, it hits you differently than a community that has capacity. And so, communities that have deprivation already have informal networks of mutual aid, perhaps that are not recognized. And so this was just one more thing, a superlative on top of an existing condition. And going forward, we definitely would prefer to have more sort of institutional capacity given to communities that have been, traditionally deprived and redlined, so that they can have some sort of, revitalization and sustainability, so that they don't rely on mutual aid as the conduit to exist or to survive.
Doug, as a farmer, how, were you also kind of seeing an increased demand? How were you kind of able to respond to that or pivot? I'm curious to hear your experience.
Yeah, I definitely received really an outpouring of demand and people looking to purchase from me and support me in any way they could. As far as being able to sell to all of the people that reached out looking to purchase, I simply did not have the scale as an urban farm. It did kind of show me again, like that there was a big opportunity there, but that I was unable to capitalize on. But it also created opportunities for other people. I was able to refer them to other farmers in my network, a lot of urban farms who were at a larger scale than I was. So I did see that. But then also, as far as the grant and funding opportunities, a lot of them were very short term, like quick turnaround kind of things, because if something was, rolled out speaking to the pandemic, it's like it's under the assumption that you're already in survival mode. Many urban farmers, farmers in general were in survival mode. And then, if you're a farmer of color, you're already at a disadvantage, as far as lacking infrastructure, like I mentioned before. So it just kind of was a really tight squeeze. It was well appreciated. But again, like it just highlights the systemic issues that Black farmers face and disadvantages that really, those are the things that need to be targeted: the education, the infrastructure, and really the stewardship. A focus on stewardship is really what I like to see more of.
Thank you. I think, yeah, that's a really important point. And I'm curious, we touched on this a little bit in talking about resource allocation, but, it was a moment where we're asking a lot of small, diversified farmers to pivot in a very quick way. And I'm curious about, what are ways in which we can, in the future, help farmers to do this and set them up to be more nimble in future crises?
I definitely would say that as another thing that's a big factor in all of this is relationships and trust. So many, Black people in this country have a fear or trust complex with, the powers that be, the people that, the governmental organizations that have the funds, public resources. I think that more, and really it can be financial investment that is put into that. And I think that has proven itself, like even around, say, the vaccine, like Black America is fearful of a vaccine, especially. because of the Tuskegee experiment. You know what I mean? So just really investing in that. I don't really know exactly what that looks like, but I know that that's a big problem that isn't really being addressed the way it needs to, is the trust. And then figuring out who are the stakeholders in the Black farming community that are well equipped to kind of steward the proper allocation of these funds and facilitate and help bring, essentially hold hands of the people that need to be brought up to speed to be in a position where they can capitalize the way that the funds are being intended to be capitalized upon.
So I just want to take a moment to note that we have got some really great questions in the Q&A so far, and I'm excited to ask our panelists those. We're going to do the Q&A questions at the end of the ones that we've got for you, but those will be addressed, and keep these great questions coming because this is a great conversation. So as we're continuing to think about how we want this system to be rebuilt as people who care about it or are working in it, or who are interested in helping those who are working in it. I guess one fun question that we can ask ourselves that has serious implications for the work that all of us do is, like, if we had a magic wand, and anything that we wanted to change about the system was at our disposal, I'd like to ask, each of you, if you want to touch on it, what would be the one most impactful change that you would make to make a more resilient and equitable food system? Jess, I might pick on you because you're unmuted.
Oh, I was. I didn't realize I put a target on myself just because I didn't have my microphone. So I think for me, we talk a lot about, I love new farmer training programs, and they're like super important, and investing in farmers. But I think we always have to keep in mind that there will be a role for paid labor and hired labor on farms, and seriously addressing a lot of the historic inequities that exist for that population. So the fact that they've been historically excluded from so many labor laws and labor legislation, labor protections, that that conversation around workers' rights has to be a part of building a better food system. And especially given that it contributes to the sustainability of our communities, right? Like addressing people's wages. I think jobs in the larger food industry, I think it's like 1 in every 6 jobs is in the food chain somewhere in the private sector. And so like people's wages, and having in some industries, not so much in farm work, but in some industries, it's about like having stable shifts, and knowing what knowing what their schedule is going to be, and having fair scheduling practices. And there's like different states that are looking at legislation around stuff like that, around actual wages, around the right to organize and not being discriminated or having retaliation because they engage in organizing practices. Like all of those are like essential to building strong communities that have some resilience in them when these kinds of things hit, right? Like so that folks are able to not be living quite so paycheck to paycheck so tightly, right? Because it's like right now, it's like you miss one paycheck, you like lose 1 week of work, and you run the risk of, well, for a lot of folks, they are at risk of not being able to pay their rent or being kicked out of their home. So just thinking about workers' rights as an essential piece of what it means to build a better food system.
I saw Senator McCray, you were getting ready to maybe say something too, so I'm going to pick on you.
No problem at all. I think that Jessica highlighted some good points. She's after my heart. I'm not sure if she's like sneaking in and knew that I was in the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, and very, very big fan of just workers and the role that we all play in our communities. You know, Shelby, when I think of that piece of it, I think about our young people, and I think about one of the greatest assets that they have is the time. So I'm 38, and I think about how a Doug, how a Taffy can reflect on these young people and make sure that we pour into them so that they know the importance of urban farming. We try our best to do that through our Department of Agriculture in the state of Maryland, and making sure that, you know, sometimes we feel as though these issues are isolated. So we think that farming is just a rural issue when it's an urban and rural. We have urban farms right here in Baltimore, Maryland, might not be as large, but the reality is that there are a lot of opportunities. As we're have the Operation Core money pouring in the city right now, and we're knocking down these buildings, it's creating a lot of land, it's creating a lot of space. I think that we should always be taking advantage of those opportunities. So my biggest wish or what we're working on is in reference to just educating our young people on this issue and the importance of this issue, so that we know that while the time that we spend at this moment, that we're actually building something, and we know it's going to be bigger than where we are at this moment.
Senator McCray, I love hearing that, the educational component on it, and bridging the gap, and figuring out how we meet people, you know, as advocates and people who are working on this. And Doug, I remember when we were thinking through the questions of this panel, one of the things that you were saying is like resource sharing and showing the way and lifting up as we climb, whether it's in just the farming skills context or in the entrepreneurship context. I'm really curious to hear what, you know, magic wand fix, you know, would help make that a reality, and maybe hear a little more about what your vision for good mentorship and leadership to bring people into this would be.
Yeah, definitely. I'm a big believer in lifting as you climb. Myself, with my farm, I have from day one, I've had a farm in residence program where I shared free space at my urban farm with a local food entrepreneur who has some urban farming savvy and wanted to take on, you know, managing their own plots. I really would like to see more of that. But I'd like to see more of that from people who are more, you know, have higher level expertise and resources than myself doing stuff like that. Because if you liken it to even say like the tech industry, they have, you know, accelerators and incubator programs where it almost foolproofs your success, or at least your credibility, being up under the wing of somebody who is doing it at a high level. The credentials, the network, that alone, I think that that's the best way. That's one of the best ways to ensure success and longevity and sustainability for, you know, new up and coming farmers or disadvantaged farmers. So yes, I definitely agree with bringing people up with you on your journey up. Or if you're the top, you should be doing it the most.
Thank you. And I guess I'll turn this one to Taffy too, so we can round it out. If you had that magic wand to change some things, what would you be doing to make things more just and equitable?
Yeah, my two things, I have not one thing, I have two things, and they're two very big things. The first one is having some sort of reparations framework. You know, 98% of all farmland in America is owned by white farmers, and it's been inherited. And so wealth is generational in America in many, many ways. And so if we hope for communities of color, like any Bipoc communities, to be able to lift up their communities and have a starting point for future generations, then we have to believe that they should be able to steward their own assets and have some land. So that's the first one. The second one is immigration reform. We cannot live in a country where we have thousands of people, millions, in fact, who are willing and are able to work and are working and paying taxes, but are not recognized as human beings. So those are my two big things.
Thank you.
I love those two things.
That was a really inspiring set of answers. And I love that question. I love kind of asking folks to get a little pie in the sky and dream, because that's how we get there. My next question is kind of a dovetail to that. So in kind of thinking about our ideal vision of an equitable ag and food system, what are some fundamental things that you all would like policymakers, stakeholders, and white allies to know? So kind of educational gaps that you think would be critical in addressing to get to those big dreams.
I think that one of the biggest educational gaps is just understanding taxes, just financial management. I'm guilty of this as well. I was guilty of it for the first 2 years that I was running my farm. I was so focused on just getting it going, as hard as that was. I just completely ignored the thing, if you're going to raise money or go to a bank for a loan, you need to have documented financials. I just completely was oblivious to that. Many entrepreneurs and business people are guilty of this, but I think that financial, savvy and just, responsibility in context of farming is something that is often left out. People invest labor, time that they don't even, they have no idea what it would cost to hire a body to do the work that you've been doing yourself. So I think that just having like that kind of guidance is really important. It would be really high impact.
Yeah, that's so true. Financial literacy and education is something that we don't often talk about being a tool that that a lot of folks could benefit from tapping into.
Well, to round out these questions that we've got for you.
Do other people, I'd like to hear from other people first. Sorry, Morgan, if other folks just have things that they'd like to speak to, and then we can move on. So this was just to repeat the question, what are some educational gaps or things that you would like to see kind of key stakeholders, policymakers, or white allies know about in order to get to a more equitable and just food system?
I think the things that I would talk about, we've talked about sort of the important role of workers' rights and Taffy's call out for immigration reform. Those are sort of key fundamental pieces to being able to move forward for me.
Shelby, if I could just jump in here, I think that I would like to see from a key stakeholders piece of it, a number of folks don't always know how the government plays a role. And, if you ask many people who's their local council person, senator, or delegates, many of them can't speak to it. They can speak to the federal folks, the president, the United States senator, but a lot of that action is happening on a local level. And Shelby, I bring this piece up because one of the things that I learned, especially in the space that I'm in at this moment, from House of Delegates to the Senate, is that we all pay taxes, but we all don't see how taxes come back to our respective neighborhoods or the issues that we care deeply about. So one of the things that I would like to see, I would like to encourage, is that there are grant programs out there from the Department of Ag. One of them is called Marbico, is the agency that kind of facilitate a number of these grant opportunities. But we have to make sure that we're included in actually applying for it, because then we can put pressure in making sure that the percentage that is supposed to come to these certain neighborhoods are there. And I'm going to give you an example. I had a secretary come out to my neighborhood. And I wanted him to tour a couple of the areas that I think that needed dire help, that don't get the state resources that's necessary. And as we closed out the meeting, and he said, "Cory, I love to help you, but please tell me how many of them had put in for the grant in the last 2 years." And I made sure that the executive director of the respective organization in my neighborhood had also heard that piece of it. Let us leverage those opportunities as your legislators and say, because if we don't put it in, it's our fault. But if you put it in and you don't get it, then that puts the onus back on us to say, what did they need to do different, or what did they do wrong to make sure that it's successful in the next piece of it. And I say that because a lot of us, especially as an African-American community, we're prideful. So we say, hey, we can do these things on our own. But the reality is that other communities aren't doing it on their own. They're using our resources to lift up their neighborhoods. And we have to make sure that we reciprocate that piece of it. That's what I would like the key stakeholders to just do. First, know your local, whoever they are. And second, make sure that they're getting some of their tax money coming back to their neighborhood.
Thank you, Senator McCray, for laying that out, and all of you, thinking about how that dynamic needs to change. As we're thinking through all of these questions that we've thought through today, so far, we still have our Q&A questions to think through too. But for these questions and the conversation we're having, it's a dynamic one. It's a conversation that you all have had before the pandemic and certainly before tonight in this panel. It's a conversation that we're going to be having after this and after the pandemic is over. And, it's important to think about where we're going. And so all of these issues, we know, as you said, it's going to need policy changes. It's going to need systemic changes. It will need personal changes from consumers and from, people who are trying to help. And so just to close it out, we've already thrown around some really good policy examples and things that we would like to see and what we'd like to help. But as we're thinking about our food system, where do we need to go? Like for all of you, having the expertise that you have, what's a space that you'd like to see us in, or what would a better, more just system look like? What would it feel like to you?
So for me, it would look like more food varieties. I always use this example. I have 3 nieces who are my life, that people always eat like 3 or 4 varieties of apples, yet we have like 40 to 50 varieties of apples. And so we have untapped resources, including things that are native to the state of Maryland, like pawpaws and things like that, that we are not utilizing. So we need to expand our repertoire in terms of what we consider as food, and just expanding our food varieties, because that's the only way we protect the planet. And that's the only way that we can, conserve our good soils and do a whole bunch of things like silvopasture. I'm also a goat farmer. So it's one of those things, like we have to have a whole system approach here. We can't just keep on buying the 2 things. We can't spend the whole season buying arugula and then be that this is my vegetable of the summer type thing. 2 years ago, it was kale. Everybody was buying kale chips type thing. So we need to be able to expand our food sources, and we need to not be afraid to make room at the table for everyone. Because when there's room at the table for everyone, we have more than enough. And so we shouldn't be afraid of the future of allowing everyone to have a space at the table, because that's the way we build a community that's resilient and that's fair and just.
So this is a super short-term thing, and it's about making sure that people can be at the table. So there's been action taken in different states to assure that our essential workers are protected during the COVID pandemic. Some states have done it through legislation, some have done it through executive orders by the governors, but folks working in food and farming in Maryland don't have a lot of mandatory protections. A lot of employers, like the poultry plants, they take their temperature when they come to work, but they don't show them their temperature. They don't send them home. They give them ice cream so that it actually comes lower. There's just lots of things. And I want to make sure people can get to that table that Taffy's setting and enjoy the wide variety of food. And every day they're going out and risking their lives right now.
I think that we almost need to stress and almost sell the value of having transparency in where your food is coming from. I think that it's kind of an intuitive thing. If you think about it, it should be appealing. It should be as important as, driving a nice car or having material things. But I just don't think that, I think that it needs a push as far as the appeal and, just the look of how that is the true wealth. So, I mean, again, part of what I do with New Brooklyn Farms is I consider myself a brand. I consider myself a community where that is cool. So if more people think, because as a farmer professional, it's easy to just bury your head and just work, and never think, what does my brand look like? How do I inspire other people? But it's really exhausting, so it's fair. But I think that that's a really important piece that could really change the game and really develop the interest and appeal that also that the farming space needs, local farming.
All right. Does anyone have anything else to add? If not, I think we might move on to the Q&A. There's quite a list building up over here. All right, so let's go ahead and dive into that. The first question that we have is for you, Taffy. Someone's just curious what crops you're growing that are unique and how the crops have been adjusted to growing here in this region and climate.
Okay, so I that's a lovely question, because I went all out to experiment this year, and I grew a lot of callaloo, which is grown in West Africa. And so I'm from Southern and East Africa. So callaloo is not my vegetable, but I grew a lot of callaloo, which is grown in West Africa and in the Caribbean, and it did perfectly well. In fact, it's a cut and grow again crop. So it grows quickly, like within like 4 to 6 weeks, you cut it and it keeps on growing. It's an easy vegetable. It has the same sort of protein level as spinach. So it's a great thing to grow. I tried to grow coral sorghum and it failed dismally. And it was coral sorghum from Sudan, and it did not do as well as I thought. But I will try again next year. And I grew something from Zanzibar, Tanzania, which is where I was born, and it's something called miri honey basil. And it's a basil that's used specifically in perfumes and as an aromatic. So I did that. So I would say that, whenever you're trying an ethnic crop, there's easy varieties that can easily adapt to the Mid-Atlantic region, which is what Maryland, Virginia, and Delaware is. And those normally tend to be like things that are in the Nebraska range. So things that, anything to do with like a spinach type variety and a kale type variety will probably grow very easily. When you get your grain variety, it might be a bit more tricky, but I grew a lot of that this year, and that was fun.
Great, thank you, Taffy. This next question is from Liz Henderson. Happy to see you on here, Liz. So we talked about this a little bit with transportation and complete streets, but she asks, what is the best way to make sure people have access to the food that they need?
I'm going to say, before Senator McCray comes in, an adequate transit system. In Maryland, we've had a fight for many years around funding the MTA, which is a state agency, and it has a shortfall. And we have a governor who does not want to fund the state agency. I could go into the years of canceling the red line and all the rest of it, but transit, having an adequate, safe, reliable transit is probably the key way for people to have access to good food.
And Shelby, I just want to chime in on it. And I like Google Taffy, and she's like extraordinary, not just in food, but also in transit. But I just wanted to just say that you can't think about it and let folks sell you lip service. It's very, very important from a governmental standpoint. And you can't try to get in the game during the middle or during the end when things have already been appropriated, the planning has already taken place. So it's important when we talked about complete streets, thinking about it right there when that conversation begins, and being able to travel along with it is very, very, very important. From not just a state piece with the MTA, and Taffy's absolutely right in reference to the funding not coming to our respective region in the manner that it should be, but also from a local level. You have circulators. They've got a $4 billion budget. While we have a $46 billion budget in the state, they still got a $4 billion budget in the city of Baltimore, and transit is a component to that, and access is very much a part of that conversation. So I just wanted to thank you for lifting that up, because it's a very, very important piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, in rural Maryland, it's obviously like being able to drive a car, and Maryland was a sort of a leader in making sure that the undocumented community could get driver's licenses several years ago. So that's been a big game changer for most of the immigrant community, especially on the Eastern Shore.
All right, we've got 2 questions from Aya. Her first question is, what is the role of community gardens in city environments for addressing food insecurity during a pandemic?
I would say that community gardens simply just serve as an alternative source of food. Low cost, typically, it's a very small membership fee to be a member of community garden. And they allow whoever that member is to produce food for themselves and their family. I think that the bigger role it hopefully plays is that it creates that drive for you to scale that up. So if you have a small plot at a community garden, hopefully you have that chip in you that's like, okay, if I can really get all my greens from this small space, what could I do with my backyard? What could I do with my neighbor's backyard together with mine? It hopefully sparks, whoever's involved in the community garden as to the power of a small space to, address food insecurity.
The gardens that CATA have been like a really essential space for addressing what Taffy brought up earlier about having culturally appropriate produce. It's hard to get in a lot of neighborhoods. So that our gardens have been spaces where we've been able to grow food specifically for the Mexican and Central American community, and like culinary herbs and just things that they can't find elsewhere. And that really goes back to addressing like a lot of even just nutrition issues, like when people don't have access to the food that they're used to and that they know and that they love. It can often be hard for them to adapt to new foods and like figure out like the nutritional value of those foods. And so it's been like a really important piece of keeping our folks connected to their culture, but also like enabling them to, I'm starting to fumble now, but
No, that's great. I think you said it very well. I've got the other question from Aya. She asked, how would you motivate young BIPOC people to get into farming?
I say show them success and show them people who are relatable. I think those are the 2 highest impact things. Show them they can make some money doing it and that it is sustainable and it's not just, a hellhole of being a struggling farmer for your entire life.
This next question kind of ties into that, but someone is asking that they'd like to hear more about something that was raised earlier, land access, and what are ways, it's directed toward Doug, but I think anyone could speak to this, that you all are kind of seeing a support for increased land access for BIPOC farmers, and what specifically could be done at state and county government levels.
So I'm not going to speak about nationally, but locally at the state and local government level, especially at the local government level, zoning. So, zoning laws as to where you can grow things and what, what is zoned what. So if we're not looking at Baltimore City, because, Baltimore City, a lot of the soil has to be trucked in because the soil has been contaminated because of years of lead poisoning and things like that. But if we're talking about the surrounding jurisdictions, like in Baltimore County, Hartford, Howard, all the rest of it, we have a lot of residential land that is sometimes used for, unnecessary purposes, like excessive golf courses and things like that. So zoning is something that you can affect at your local level so that more people can use that for gardening space. A lot of jurisdictions locally don't even allow you to keep veggies at the front of your yard. So little things like that. We saw that in the pandemic, a lot of people wanted to be able to keep backyard chickens, for example, for eggs. So that's a little thing. It might seem like a little thing, ordinance to change, but then it's important enough to give like protein to a little family to have like 2 or 3 chickens in the backyard type thing. So zoning is something that can be done at a local level. At a state level, I think it's important to ask, where does the money for the state go towards ag? And so in all states, we have big ag and we've got small ag, and most small ag, which is farms under 100 acres, are owned by families, whereas big ag is normally owned by corporations. So being able to advocate for any sort of state funds to go towards family-owned farms and farmers like Doug and myself and other farmers in urban areas and in suburban areas, and even rural areas, as opposed to some sort of conglomerate that's just growing soy. So that's important.
Shelby, I'm gonna jump in on this question, and I'm gonna jump in on a previous question, if that's okay. When the previous question spoke to the young people, I'm born and raised in the city of Baltimore, and sometimes our young people are limited to the 4x4 block radiuses that they grow up in. So they really don't have that opportunity to be around something that's different from them. And I speak as an example of it because I didn't really know much outside of my neighborhood until I joined the apprenticeship program to really start to see things that are a little bit different. Never got on a plane till I was 25, didn't never leave the country until I was 30 some years of age. So some of us can only see what we see every day from that standpoint. So I think that broadening our young people's horizon and making sure that they're around the folks, as Doug has stated, but also it's very, very important to see people that look like you in these spaces doing these types of things is very, very important. And you know, I just remember when I was in elementary school, and I remember our elected officials actually coming to my to my respective elementary school, and that was something that I love to model for other young people, but they have to be able to see it, because then they can internalize it and be able to see themselves in that space. And to the question that you currently asked around local and state government, I think it's very important because we have a very old infrastructure in the city of Baltimore. So a number of these houses have to come down because it's just dangerous. So as they're tearing down these infrastructures, what the city is trying their best to do is have partnerships with different organizations to help them to take care of that respective space. You'll find that they're doing this through memorandums of understanding, long-term agreements for 10 years, 7 years, and things of that nature. And when that long-term agreement happens, that forces an opportunity for the state to be able to help from a capital standpoint, to be able to complement the land that they have on that space. And I'll give examples. So when you drive through Baltimore City, right there on Kenyon and Brims Lane, you'll see a small urban farm. If you're right there at St. Clair and Collington, Civic Works has a small urban farm across from Lily Mae Carroll. So, and what happens is we as state legislators, because it's not a corporation benefit, as long as it's a nonprofit benefit, we get to come in and help them with some form of a bond bill or some type of capital to be able to complement the great work that they're doing. So just to speak to local, and then how state can kind of indirectly impact those decisions and opportunities, I should call them, to be able to take advantage of. Thank you.
We've got a question from Michelle, and it's one that I think ties into a couple other questions on the list, so we'll try to lump them together. But the question is, what actions can people take to advocate for real and long-term solutions? Somebody asked a question, specifically in the immigration context. When we look to immigration reform, some things that we've seen at the congressional level, are things that are going to take a lot of time, or might even have, long time periods associated with them. So maybe when we think about permanence for our immigrant farm workers, and then we can also think about how we make long-term solutions for Bipoc farmers here.
It's been a number of folks who have talked about sort of like long-term investments in communities. I think Doug touched on it when he was talking about sort of the the need for not just the moment of throwing money during the pandemic, but sort of long-term investment in relationships and building. And obviously, like big topics like immigration reform require some longevity of us, which we're not a society that's really great at longevity always. But it's, I think during this pandemic, it's really highlighted a lot of issues that require us to be tuned in for a longer period of time, right? Like racial justice is another one. Like we can't just tune in now for the next week or month. We've got to be around and we've got to be present. And so I think connecting up with the organizations that are working on these topics, your local organizations, and really like, digging in a little and figuring out how do we commit ourselves over a longer period of time is needed.
This might be the last question, depending on, maybe we have time for two more, but this one I thought was interesting because it kind of ties back to the different kinds of foods that you were talking about, Taffy, and kind of the importance of diversifying what farmers are growing and trying to hit on ethnic crops. But this question is, Jordan found that some people are reluctant to try new foods that they are unfamiliar with, especially new offerings found at farmers markets. What can farmers do to introduce produce that has little connection to our region and a particular community's food heritage?
So the easy answer to that question is support farmers from that community who are already growing that crop. So it's a lot of times we're looking for a silver bullet, and the silver bullet is already within that community. This happens a lot, specifically in BIPOC communities. So Black, Indigenous, people of color communities normally have people, well-meaning people from out of the community who say, we want to help you. How can we help you? When there are people already in that community doing that work, and all they need is the support to help them move along. So I would say that it'd be great if other farmers in Maryland, not BIPOC farmers, also wanted to grow ethnic crops, but there's already ethnic farmers in the state of Maryland who grow ethnic crops. So maybe just choosing to buy from them. And choosing to make space for them. So a lot of times whenever we, if you read a lot of farming journals, farming manuals, op-eds in the newspaper, online, who gets profiled as a farmer? That's an interesting thing. So it's always making, uplifting and giving sort of credibility to other farmers who are already doing that work is important. And I would say that one of the things I worried about when I first started growing ethnic crops was, am I painting myself into a corner? And I realized I didn't want to spend hours in the sun and putting in a lot of input into the dirt for things that I did not like to grow. It was that simple for me. And so, and I knew that there were hundreds, if not thousands of people like me who wanted to eat, things that were indigenous to their culture. And so I made that choice. And I would also say that a lot of times, one of the things I've done is that I worked on a farm to fork food truck for over here. And a lot of times people don't know how to cook the different things. So it's not so much that they're afraid of something or they don't like it. They've never tried it before. So having things like demos at farmers markets, just mixing it up here and there is the sort of thing that raises public awareness and educational awareness around things and makes it, more palatable to a broader audience.
Thank you, Taffy. Before we move on to some closing statements to wrap all of this up, I just wanted to give you all a chance to share any final words, thoughts, questions you may have yourselves.
No, I'm thankful to have shared the panel with all of you this evening. I hope someday I can come visit your farm, Taffy.
Yeah.
And Doug too.
Definitely. Likewise, some really rich perspectives here, and thanks to Shelby and Morgan and Bernard for organizing such a great conversation.
Yeah, I'm also super thankful. I'm so glad there are people who still care about the land, about other communities, about each other. And well, that's the only way we're going to be able to survive not only this pandemic, but, into the future. So I'm really thrilled and honored to be part of this panel and be part of this community as well. And support your Baltimore farmers. Both me and Doug are part of a Baltimore Black Farmer Fund. So support us.
I'm just going to say that first, humbled and honored, Morgan, Bernard, Shelby, thanks for this opportunity. But most importantly, it feels so good to be with the people that are on the ground doing the work. So while there are a number of conversations that I get to have, the only thing that competed with you all today was when I was reading the first graders. So this is really, really a good opportunity. Like I said, with the people that are actually doing the work. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. Well, from all of us at Waterkeepers Chesapeake and Fair Farms, I'd like to say thank you to all of you wonderful panelists for sharing your time and expertise and your talent. Thank you to all of our attendees today, and a gracious thank you to our sponsor, M&T Bank, for helping us sponsor this amazing conversation. Please be sure to follow Waterkeepers Chesapeake on our social media channels and hit up all of our presenters and M&T Bank who also have social media. And we'll be sending out a recording to all of the folks that have registered. Please have a great evening and stay safe and stay healthy and stay well. Thank you.